Hi, everybody. This is Tina Rose. I'm broadcasting live from my office at home. This is our second AP English live Q&A from AdvanceKentucky. Just like last week when we had a lot of questions about AP literature, this week we have a lot of questions about AP language in the exam for that class. Another shout out to Clinton County and to Melissa Talent. I think they're having a cheesecake party tonight during this live Q&A. I have a lot of questions that people have already sent me that we're going to address first. And I have our math director, Monique Morton, who is monitoring the Twitter feed for me. So if I get any questions throughout the night or after the presentation is finished, then I'll be able to address those. And I'll give it a couple of minutes before I sign off, just to make sure if there are any last minute questions, we can get those in. So I hope you have a pen and paper. I hope you're ready to see the answers to the questions you've already sent in. And so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so you can see on this first page the hashtag, if you want to send in any questions as we're going through this, it's hashtag AskTinaKY. Or if you think of something later, you can always tweet the question, or you can email me directly at trose@kstc.com. So the first section we're going to talk about is preparing for the multiple choice section of the AP Lang and Composition exam. I had about 5 or 6 different people who asked me to give you some tips on time management for that. So let's take a look at some of the things that you can do. When you first get the booklet, you want to examine all of the passages in the test booklet first. Give yourself about 60 seconds to go through those and choose the passage that you understand the best and do that passage and those questions first. So you're always going to have one passage that seems a lot more difficult than the others, and you'll have one passage that seems pretty easy or more simple to you. Whichever one you feel the most comfortable with is the one that you should do first. And you should always save the most difficult passage for last. Remember, this is a timed exam, and you have a lot of questions and passages to get through. So you want to get as many points as you possibly can. When you're reading the passages, you want to monitor your time for each passage. Each passage and set of questions should take you about 15 minutes each. So if you have, I always tell kids, either find out if there will be a big clock in the room so you can keep track of your time. If there won't be, you need to bring a watch. You need to wear a watch, because you will have to keep track of how much time you're using. Okay. As you're monitoring for each passage, you also want to monitor your time for each question. If you get stuck on a difficult question, just move on. Don't waste valuable time worrying about the very difficult questions. You'll have somewhere between, I'm gonna give you a range of 5 to 10 very difficult questions, and those are going to be spread throughout the whole exam. So don't spend 3 or 4 minutes on one of those questions. If it's super hard and you can't even like get rid of 2 of the answers, move on and save that to go back at the end to fill in. And that's the last thing I want to say about that. Answer all of the multiple choice questions. Leave nothing blank. Answers that are correct will give you points, and answers that are incorrect don't count against you. So there's no reason on this exam to leave anything blank. Here are some questions that I got specifically about multiple choice. And the first one is, I struggle with recognizing anaphora and epistrophe. Any help? And what I would say about that is, I would bet that if there's going to be a question about anaphora, there's only going to be one. Or any of those really difficult rhetorical devices that you study and you have a really hard time recognizing them or remembering the names. I think you should really focus on understanding the passage and annotating the passages as you go. If you have trouble recognizing those two things, don't worry about it. It's not going to make or break you whether or not you know one of those words. Should I read the entire passage in the multiple choice section at first, or just the topic, sentence, and thesis, and then when answering questions, read other necessary parts? And that's a pretty interesting question, because you should know by now, after having some practice with your teachers, you should know what kind of questions give you trouble and what kind of passages give you trouble. I would actually recommend, instead of just reading topic, sentence, and thesis statements and then trying to muddle your way through the questions and then read more as you go, I think you'll have better, you'll do better if you read the whole passage and annotate as you go. There's nothing wrong with skimming the questions that go with the passage and then thinking to yourself, okay, I know I'm going to have to look for these line numbers, and I'm going to have to look for this particular type of metaphor or this word in context. So you kind of get an idea of what to annotate for as you're reading the passages. I think that's better than trying to skip through and then skip back and then try to reread again. And finally, what if you get a question and you draw a blank about what it is asking you to do? And this one could actually be for the multiple choice section, or it could be for the essay section. If you draw a blank and you're in multiple choice, then move on. Don't sit there and worry over it. After you go through a few other questions and you go back to that one at the end, maybe something will trigger it. If you have no idea what to do and you have no clue, always just go ahead and guess, because there's no reason to leave any multiple choice question blank. Okay, so as we go along, if you have some questions that are more specific about multiple choice that I haven't addressed so far, then you can tweet them. And when we come back around at the end to check for extra questions, I'll see if anybody has anything to say about that. So now we're going to move on to preparing for the essays. And this is pretty common that I get these kinds of questions that we're going to see. And the first one is, in what order should we write the essays? Do we have to write them in order? And the answer to that is no. You do not have to write the essays in order. Just like you don't have to do the multiple choice passages in order, you need to write your essays in the order in which you feel most comfortable. So if you know that the argument question is your strongest essay that you've been writing all year, you feel really confident about it, and you've looked at the 3 essay prompts and you know that you've got a really good handle on the argument question, go ahead and do that one first. Save the most difficult one for last, because you want to get as many points as you possibly can with the essays that you feel comfortable with, and then have a little bit of time with the one that you feel that you're going to struggle with at the end, to at least make sure you address the question, you get a thesis statement, and you do something with a couple of paragraphs. Can I use a pencil or should I bring a pen? Handwriting is always something that students ask about. You need to bring a black pen. You can write in just about any color that you want, but I don't recommend that. I recommend that you write with a black pen because it makes it a lot easier for the people who are going to read your essays to see what you've written. You can't use a pencil. If you use a pencil, you run the risk of it smudging before the people who read your essay get to see it. And then if they can't see it, they can't read it. And we always tell kids this. We have questions about, well, what if my handwriting's too small, or I write really messy? What should I do about that? And I always tell them, we will try to read what you've written, but if we can't see it, we can't score it. So if you know you have an issue with your handwriting, between now and when you take the exam, you might want to practice a little bit. What should we bring to the exam? You should bring a watch or something to keep time. They will not let you use your phone. And you should bring a black pen. Should I spend extra time on the thesis and topic sentence? And this is a specific writing question. You've been practicing a lot all year on your writing. You've been working on making good thesis statements. You've been working on transcend topic sentences and conclude. The most important thing that you can do for the essays is answer the question. And if you've been practicing a lot, you'll have a thesis statement and topic sentences, and that will naturally come through as you're writing through this. But always remember that we don't sit at the table and read your essay and, okay, does this have a topic sentence? Does this have a topic sentence? We do look for the thesis statement, but the most important thing is answering the question. And even if you get a little bit lost as you get started and then you warm up and you do better later on in your essay, we're always gonna score you and give you credit well. So don't worry so much about particular specific things like that. Worry about answering the question. Okay, going in the order of the exam, you know that when you get the exam, the first question you see will be the synthesis question. But I'm going to start with rhetorical analysis because it seems to be one of the most difficult essays for students. Last year, it most definitely was the most difficult one. It was the lowest scoring essay in the history of the exam. So I've always felt like, and when I'm teaching rhetorical analysis, I teach it as the cornerstone class. When you are reading the multiple choice passages, you should be doing rhetorical analysis. You should be annotating and looking for those devices and how the author is using language. That for the rhetorical analysis essay, that's what you do for essay. And even to a certain extent with the argument essay, you're doing rhetorical analysis of the pieces in your head that you're going to use for your argument. So this is really important that you understand how to do rhetorical analysis. So some of the questions that we got on this particular essay are, how many devices do we have to write about? There's always, oh, we should do 2. No, you should do 5. Do as many as you possibly can. I tell students, okay, let me just take a look here and make sure that everybody is doing okay. Okay, sorry about that. Just had a question about technical difficulties here. So how many devices do we have to write about? There is no set number of devices that you have to talk about. What I tell students is when you're doing a rhetorical analysis question, if they tell you, you might want to look at diction, repetition, and shift. Let's say those are the three they give you. Then you might want to pay attention to those. But if for some reason diction and repetition really stand out to you and you do a really good job analyzing those two things, then that should be adequate. It's not required that you address a certain number of devices. Address the ones that you see are important to the passage and to the question. If it's 2, then do those very well. If it's 3 or 4, make sure you don't end up summarizing what the devices are and where they are. Make sure you answer the question. And we'll go back to that in just a little bit. Do we have to write a 5-paragraph essay? And this goes for all 3 of the essay questions. And the answer to that is no. Knowing how to do the 5-paragraph essay is certainly a really good thing to have in your pocket when you go into a timed exam like this, because sometimes you get in there and you get really stressed and you forget everything that you know, and just all of a sudden you know you can do a 5-paragraph essay, and those are perfectly fine. But it isn't necessary. It's not something that, again, that we as readers look at and say, oh, they didn't do a 5-paragraph essay, so they can't get a 6 or higher. We don't do that. You need to have as many paragraphs as you need. And sometimes students don't like to hear that. We're like, well, I don't know how many to do. But 5-paragraph essays, absolutely not necessary. Do we need to use the pathos logos? You've been working really hard on understanding what these things are throughout the year and how they affect an argument. We call these the appeals. How does something appeal to someone's emotion? How does a writer or a speaker appeal of validation? The answer to that question, do you have to use those terms? The answer to that is no, use those terms. It's necessary to say to the reader in your essay, in paragraph 2, the author uses pathos. Pathos is one of the appeals where the author appeals to your emotions. You don't need to do that because everybody in the room reading your essay knows what these 3 things are. The most important thing for you to do is to be able to recognize what's happening in the passage and to be able to say the author is appealing to the reader's emotions by using X, Y, and Z. Or the author is appealing to our logic by showing us all of these facts and these numbers, etc. And that leads into what is more important, the devices or the comprehension of the text. And that's going to take us to actually looking at a question and how you go about answering it without focusing too much on the devices, because we see this all the time. Okay, so let's look at this question. This is a rhetorical analysis. We're not going to look at the passage. We're really just going to focus on what the question is asking you to do. In 1962, the noted biologist Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, a book that helped transform American attitudes towards the environment. Carefully read the following passage from Silent Spring. Then write an essay in which you define the central argument of the passage and analyze the rhetorical strategies that Carson uses to construct her argument. Okay. So in this one, they aren't asking you to look at 3 specific things. They're just asking you to analyze the rhetorical strategies. And you should know by now, rhetorical strategies is another way of saying devices. And they go back and forth between asking you to do rhetorical strategies and rhetorical devices. But analyze the strategies she uses to do what? Well, to construct her argument. So there are a couple of things you have to do, but the most important thing you need to know when reading the passage and getting ready to write your essay is her argument. That's the main focus for what you're going to write about, her argument. What is she trying to say? That is key. Now, in order to understand that, you have to be able to analyze the devices. And so whenever you get ready to do any of your essays, always remember, especially if you have to do rhetorical analysis or even the synthesis question, we'll look at that too, the devices should not be the cornerstone of your paper. Her argument is the cornerstone of this paper, and the devices tell us how she does it. How does she construct the argument? So that will, if you can keep that in mind, that will help you not fall into the pattern of the summary, where you find all of the devices that she uses, and then you show us where the devices are, and you tell us what the devices are, but then you don't connect it back to what her argument is and how she uses that to construct her argument. Okay? All right. Let's look at another one. And this one's really interesting. I hope you've been looking at some satire. If you've been looking at political cartoon, you've probably looked at The Onion. This is another example of a rhetorical analysis question that's previously been on the exam. The following article is a mock press release from The Onion, a publication devoted to humor and satire. Read the article carefully, then write an essay in which you analyze the strategies used in the article to satirize how products are marketed to consumers. Okay? So I'm going to ask you one more time to take a look at this and what should go in the circle. It's not the devices. That's not the center of this. It's how in the article, how products are marketed but then when we look at how the devices are used or the strategies, how are the strategies or devices used to create satire? These things are satirizing how products are marketed. So you got to understand what's being satirized, how satire works, and how the devices allow it to become. All right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the synthesis question. And of course, this will actually be the first question on the exam. This will be the, and I'm sure your teachers know that you do get an extra 15 minutes when you are taking the AP language exam. And this question is the reason you get an extra 15 minutes. You will have several sources to go through. And there are lots of different ways people ask about doing the synthesis essay. And so let's look at some of the questions that have come in the past few days, just specifically about this. The first one is, do I have to use 3 sources? And my answer to that is absolutely yes. Yes, 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 yes. You must use 3 sources if you want to get a score higher than a 4. Last year, I actually read the synthesis question, and in the course of that week, I read one of the best essays I'd read all week. It should have been a 9. It should have been an example of a 9. And I read it a couple of times, and I realized that the student had only cited 2 sources. So I took it to the table leader and I said, please double check this. Maybe I'm missing something. And sure enough, the student had only cited 2 sources. So an essay that should have been a 9 actually only got a score of a 4. So yes, 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 you must use 3 sources if you want to get anything above a 4. But then with that, if I use more than 3 sources, do I get extra credit? And the answer to that is no, not necessarily. You don't get bonus points for using extra sources. You must use 3, but you don't have to use any more than that. You can write a very good essay with only 3 sources. Now, that's not to say that you can't use more. If there are a couple of more sources that really help your argument, and you really feel like you need to include them, then by all means, you should do that. Always use the sources that help you the most. But we're not going to count, and we're not going to say, oh, look, this guy used 5, even though it's all a summary. We're going to give him an extra point or 2. If it's answering the question and it's not summarizing the sources, then you're good either way. Should I read all the sources, or should I just pick 3 to use and then move on? And this is kind of going to depend on you. It's going to depend on how well you know yourself and how you do with the synthesis question. If the synthesis question is the most difficult essay for you to write, and you save it for last, and you only have 15 minutes left to write this entire essay, then in that situation, you might want to just find the 3 that you can use and then start writing. But if it's the essay that you feel comfortable with, either the first or second one, and you have a little bit of time, you really should read all of the sources. You get that extra time at the beginning, and so there's really no reason not to read them. If you have practiced doing rhetorical analysis and reading and annotating as you go, you should be able to do that within the 15-minute period. You should be able to read all of the essay questions, including all of the sources for the synthesis question. So that's just up to you. If you have to do it at last and you have very limited time, then just pick the 3 and move on. But if you have the time and it's one of the first 2, then definitely go through all of the sources, because the one at the end may be the best source you could use for your argument. How much of the sources should I quote? And what is the best way to group sources on a synthesis essay? That's actually a pretty good question about how much should I quote. And so I'm going to show you just a really quick way to think about how much you should put in there that you're quoting from the sources. And this goes for rhetorical analysis as well. Let's say this is your essay, and I'm going to divide it into 2 little parts, okay? And so let's say this part up here is all quotes and summary of your sources. And then let's say this part is your analysis or your argument. If that's what your essay looks like, then your essay is not balanced. Your essay is way unbalanced in the wrong way. When you have so many quotes and so much information that you're summarizing from the sources, and then you only have this much that's your actual argument or your analysis, there isn't enough analysis there to override how much you've said about the sources. Now, it's true. It is true that if it's unbalanced like this and your analysis is really good, then you could get a 6. You could pull a 6 out of that. But it's really much safer if you do it like this. If you have this much analysis or argument, and then you have this much quoted. If you can do that, then you have a really good essay. If you can use ellipses, if you can insert the quotes into your own sentences, that's really the best way to do it, because you want the person reading your essay to know what you have to say about the subject. You don't want them to know how well you can summarize the sources you read. And that's what we see a lot of on this, is that students kind of get caught up summarizing the sources and telling us which side the sources are on, and then they forget that they need this part. They need analysis and argument supported by the quotes. Okay, so let's look at a question for synthesis, and let's talk about how you use those sources. This is, and again, this is just the, you know, the synthesis question is going to have 3 parts. It's going to have the introductory information, it's going to have and it's going to have the task. Introductory information carefully. Then choose an issue related to the tension in schools between individuality and conformity. You might choose an issue such as dress codes, mandatory classes, or the structure of the school day. You do not have to choose an issue that you have experienced personally. Then write an essay in which you use this issue to argue the extent to which it should support or conformity. Synthesize at least 3 of the sources for support. You may refer to the sources by their titles or by the descriptions in the parentheses. And I want to point something out on this that you usually will see in the synthesis question. And it's argue the extent to which schools should support individuality or conformity. It doesn't say, is individuality good or bad? It says to argue the extent to which schools should support those. And then you synthesize sources for support. So your center block here is going to be the extent to which schools should support. Okay? And then your sources are going to be your backup for that. You're going to use the sources to argue the extent to which they should support. That's very important to remember, that this main thing right here is what you're arguing. That's what you're talking about. The sources are only there to back you up. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to let you think about that for just a second. And finally, we're going to move on to argument. Argument seems to be, I think most students really like the argument question. It's the one place where you can use your own personal experience as valid information to back up your argument. So I only have a couple of questions about this one. And actually, I've seen these before. The first one is, can I use made up, believable evidence? Well, let's talk about that for a second. I would never tell you to make up evidence for your argument question, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's very hard to make up believable evidence. It's very hard to, it's very difficult to come up with something that the reader doesn't look at it and go, yeah, right, okay. That being said, I don't think anybody's going to track you down and try to look for proof, but you're taking a risk when you try to do that. I think that most students have lots of experiences and many things that are true that can be used for your argument. So I don't recommend making up believable evidence. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Can I use literary texts as support or evidence? This one's actually kind of tricky because I have seen students use examples from a literary text, but the examples were to support something real that had happened. So if I were teaching you how to write an argument, I probably would not recommend using literary text as support unless it is something that you feel very strongly about putting into your argument. And just make sure that it's not the focus or the center of your argument. If it's a small aside to just kind of support something else that you've used for evidence, then I think that would be okay. But it shouldn't be one of your main pieces of evidence. And last, is it okay to use first person? Yes, in the argument question, if you are relaying, and I'm thinking back about an I think it's very important to include those things that are personal experiences of your own. Okay, so we're going to look at this particular argument question, and then we'll go back to synthesis. I think I missed a question on how to group sources. So we'll go back to that in just a minute, but let's go through this. Okay, let's see. Let's go back to, I think we got a little bit of a timeout on sharing the screen. So let's see if that's going to work now. Okay, so the following passage is from Rights of Man, a book written by the pamphleteer Thomas Paine in 1791. Born in England, Paine was an intellectual, a revolutionary, and a supporter of American independence from England. Read the passage carefully, then write an essay that examines the extent to which Paine's characterization of America holds true today. Use appropriate evidence to support your argument. And I love this question. It says, write an essay that examines, here's that word again, the extent to which Paine's characterization of America holds true today. So it's not saying, is he right or wrong? It's saying, to what extent? And so let's look at what he said. If there is a country in the world where concord, according to common calculation, would be least expected, it is America, made up as it is of people from different nations, accustomed to different forms and habits of government, speaking different languages and more different in their modes of worship. It would appear that the union of such a people was impracticable. But by the simple operation of constructing government on the principles of society and the rights of man, every difficulty retires and all the parts are brought into cordial unison. There, the poor are not oppressed, the rich are not privileged, their taxes are few because their government is just, and as there is nothing to render them wretched, there is nothing to engender riots and tumults. So, yeah. So you can see why they're asking you the extent to which the extent to which it holds true. So we're going to say all parts are brought into cordial unison. The poor are not oppressed. The rich are not privileged. Taxes are few. The government is just. There is nothing to render them wretched, so there are no riots or tumults. So this is a really good question because it's very easy to argue the extent to which he was correct when he said this, because it's very easy to say, well, it is true that we do have this. However, in many situations, this is not true. And we saw a lot of really good essays that came from this particular question. Okay, so I'm going to go back to synthesis again. What is the best way to group sources on a synthesis essay? And so I'm going to ask for a little bit of clarification on that. And I'm wondering if you're meaning, is it more like 2 that are for and then 1 against? Or should you do 4 counter argument and 4? Specifically, if you could, this question is coming from Miss Talent's class. So if you could specifically ask me what you mean about grouping the synthesis sources, then we'll go back and be a little more specific about that. Okay. So I'm back, and I'm waiting to get a little clarification on the synthesis question. So I will address just a couple of more reminders for you about studying and practicing for this particular exam. Just remember that even though it's timed and you feel like you're under a lot of pressure, if you've been practicing these essays, you know yourself which ones you're going to need to work really hard. And that, for me, is one of the most important things you can do when you're practicing and getting ready for these exams, is to know which things mess you up, which are the things that make you uncomfortable. And so I have a question now. Okay. Yes, for against, just tips. So let's go back to my little chart here. And let's talk a little bit about that. And I know you're not going to like the answer to this. The answer is you group them in the best way that you can. Again, there is no of what we're looking for when we score the synthesis essay to see if you did, okay, counter argument. Oh, wait, sorry. Counter argument, and then 4, and then 4, and then conclusion. I mean, it really doesn't matter. Most people are going to do a couple of, most people are going to do a couple 4, 4, and they're going to do a counter argument, and then maybe one last mini 4. Of course, that may not be another source. That may be, you know, just another paragraph that comes back to one of these, and then a conclusion. It really doesn't matter. As long as the argument is valid and as long as you've used 3 sources for your synthesis question, it doesn't matter how you place them. I hope that was enough. I hope that kind of clears that up. Okay, so go back. And those are all of the questions that we had for tonight. And I'm going to give it just a couple of minutes. Last time when we were broadcasting, as soon as we signed off, I got like 3 questions on Twitter and another message in my email that said, can you please address this? But one of them was a whole class, and I ended up doing a whole class with someone. So I'll just remind you that if you want to find out if you're in other AP classes, such as an AP Science class or an AP Math class, you can look on AdvanceKentucky.com. And you can look at when these other live Q&As are going to be, because we're going to have them for all of the math, science, and English courses. Be available, and I'll be available from 6 midnight, the night before the English exams, the night before the English Lit and AP Language. If anybody wants to tweet a question to me or email me, then I'll be available for any last-minute nerves that you might be having preparing for these exams. So I'm looking on Twitter, and I'm looking for any extra questions that might have come up, and it doesn't look like anything new's come through. So math is finished for now. I'm getting a message that math is finished. And AP Bio is going to be having a live Q&A on Sunday at 7 p.m. One last question that's just coming through. Do you use sources for your counter argument? And yes, you can. You can, both in the synthesis question and in the argument question. You can do both. You'll find in the synthesis sources that you're going to have a few of the sources that you can use as a counter argument. And sometimes what I like to find in those sources is something that someone would use as a counter argument, and it's a weak one. So it would be a really good one for you to use to say, they may say this, however, these numbers aren't that great, or we can see from the study that it was done 30 years ago, and so now the numbers aren't valid. So absolutely, yes, you can use them. You can use them for your counter argument. All right, guys. Looks like I'll be in touch with some teachers over the next couple of days. I've really enjoyed spending some time and getting some live questions tonight. Hopefully in the next year or so, we'll be able to do a lot more of these. And if you have any more questions, email me, trose@kstc.com, or you can tweet me more questions, #AskTinaKY. Good luck, and I'll be seeing you. Bye.